They told me I should be grateful they let me stay as long as they did. Imagine that. Grateful for being allowed to exist in a house I bought. I can still hear my son's voice when I close my eyes, smooth and measured like he was trying not to startle a wild animal. He said it at the doorway, hands in his pockets, the way he always stood when he wanted to look reasonable. Behind him, Carla hovered in that silent way of hers, lips pressed together, the faintest trace of triumph hidden behind concern. It was April. The lilac tree outside was just beginning to bloom, and I remember thinking how absurd it was that something so alive could bloom while I was being told to pack my life into 2 suitcases. I am 78 now. I live by the sea in Oregon, in a small rental that smells of salt and old wood. The walls creak when the wind shifts, and the kettle screams louder than necessary, as if it's the only one allowed to raise its voice. I came here because it was the farthest place from their polished silence, the only place I could hear myself think without wondering who was listening. I wasn't always alone, and I wasn't always old. Once, I had a name that meant something more than mom or guest. I had a husband who laughed like thunder, and a son who used to bring me dandelions in clenched fists. I said yes to every request he made, because that's what mothers do. They say yes, even when it costs them pieces of themselves. When he called me 2 years ago asking for help with the down payment on a forever home, I didn't hesitate. I sold bonds, withdrew savings, wrote the check, and told myself it was an investment in his happiness. He promised it was temporary, just until he refinanced. I believed him. Belief is a habit you don't lose with age. It just hurts more when it's misplaced. The first time I met Carla, she wore white silk and an expression like she'd already endured too much. She called me Mary Ann instead of Mom, which I told myself was modern, polite, her way of showing independence. She had perfect posture, perfect teeth, and an allergy to sincerity. During the wedding toast, she thanked everyone except me. I smiled anyway. That night, Daniel told me I looked tired, and maybe I should head home early. I thought he meant well. I always think people mean well until they prove me wrong. After the wedding, calls became shorter, visits rarer. When I did come by, Carla had lists. Please take off your shoes. Please don't feed the baby sugar. Please don't rearrange the pantry. I complied, as if I were a guest in a hotel whose staff found me inconvenient but necessary for a good review. And then came the day she told me, over coffee brewed by a machine that hissed like a warning, that she and Daniel needed privacy, space, balance, all those words people use when they want to sanitize cruelty. She said it sweetly, as though compassion could erase intent. Daniel said little, just nodded, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond me, on the clean lines of the marble countertop that my money had bought. When I left that morning, the house was immaculate, not a picture out of place, not a trace that I had ever lived there. Even my framed photograph from their honeymoon shelf had vanished. I carried 2 suitcases, one with clothes, one with papers, old deeds, account statements, a single photograph of Derek holding Daniel on his shoulders at the county fair. I didn't cry. Crying is for people who still expect to be comforted. I walked to the corner, hailed a cab, and told the driver to take me to the nearest station. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay where gratitude was expected like rent. The ride was silent except for the driver's soft humming, something old and off-key. I stared out the window at the rows of manicured lawns, each one a perfect lie, each one pretending that order could substitute for love. The train to Oregon took 2 days. I slept sitting up, my knees aching, my hands curled around my purse as if it held more than it did. The woman across the aisle offered me an orange and asked where I was headed. Home, I said, and she smiled, not knowing there was no such place anymore. When I arrived, the air smelled of rain and seaweed, sharp and forgiving at once. I rented the first small cottage I found, a place once owned by a fisherman who'd left hooks in the window frames. The realtor called it charming. I called it mine, because for the first time in years, no one could tell me where to stand. The first night I boiled water for tea, the kettle screamed so loud it startled me, but I didn't turn it down. I let it howl, and for a moment, I imagined it was my own voice finally escaping. Sometimes I still see Daniel's face in my dreams, younger, softer, the boy who once refused to sleep without my hand on his hair. In those dreams, he asks me why I left, as if he didn't hand me the reason wrapped in polite language. I wake before I answer. There are mornings when the sea mist creeps into the kitchen, and I sit at the table watching it blur the world outside. I think of the word mother, how it shrinks over time, becomes a title people discard when it no longer suits the decor of their new life. But here, with the waves whispering against the rocks, I'm beginning to remember the woman who existed before that word consumed her. She had opinions, humor, hunger. She had a voice that wasn't an apology. I'm trying to find her again, piece by piece, in the quiet. I don't tell people much when they ask why I moved here. I say it was the weather or the view. I don't tell them I was exiled by politeness, that my own son chose comfort over connection, that I left behind not just a house, but the illusion that love owed me safety, because saying it out loud still feels like treason, though against whom I'm no longer sure. Some nights, I walk to the pier and watch the lights of the fishing boats fade into the distance. The sea keeps its secrets, so do I, but I can feel the tide turning, slow and certain. The same tide that once took everything from me is bringing something back. Dignity, perhaps, or just the simple knowledge that survival can be quiet and still count as defiance. And when the wind howls against the windows, I whisper to it like an old friend. They told me I should be grateful. Then I laugh softly, because now, at last, I am, but not for them. I'm grateful to have finally left the door they closed behind me without looking back. It began, as betrayals often do, with something that sounded like reason. Daniel called me 2 weeks after I moved into the cottage, his voice calm, practiced, almost tender in the way a doctor might explain a terminal diagnosis. He said he wanted to sort out the paperwork regarding the house, just to make sure everything was tidy. He said it as if we were discussing a grocery list, not the single largest thing I had ever given him. He told me the refinance was complete, that all I needed to do was sign a few digital forms that would streamline ownership for tax purposes. I asked him to email them, and when I opened the attachments, my hands began to shake. The documents weren't about taxes. They were a full transfer of ownership, erasing my name entirely from the deed. He'd left the signature line blank, waiting for me to surrender the last trace of myself. I called him back immediately, and his voice tightened just slightly. Mom, please, this is just legal housekeeping. Carla's been worried about liabilities. You don't need to be involved anymore. That word, anymore, hung between us like smoke. I told him I'd think about it. He sighed, long and theatrical, the way he used to when I wouldn't let him go out late as a teenager. He said, "You're making this complicated." I said, "You're making this cruel." We hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I sat at the small wooden table in my kitchen, the one that wobbles if you lean on it too hard, and I spread out the papers like tarot cards. Every clause, every signature line felt like an incision. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Around 3 a.m, I made a cup of tea and took it to the porch, letting the salt air burn the back of my throat. The moon hung low, heavy as regret, and for the first time I whispered it aloud. He wants to erase me. It wasn't anger yet, just the raw shock of seeing something you'd always feared finally take shape. By morning, I had decided to call the bank listed on the refinance documents. The woman on the phone was polite but cautious, the kind of voice that lives between sympathy and procedure. She asked for verification. I gave her every number I could find. After a long pause, she said, "Mrs. Harlow, I see your name here, but it was recently removed from the active title. The primary owner is now Daniel Harlow." The words came through clearly, without malice, but they landed like a slap. I asked when the change occurred. She hesitated, then said, 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks, while I was still unpacking boxes, while I was still believing he'd simply needed time to cool down. He hadn't waited for my permission. He'd already done it. I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still. I could hear the kettle starting to whistle in the background, the same shrill, living sound that had comforted me before. This time it sounded like warning. I turned it off, poured nothing, and stood in the middle of that small kitchen with my hands on the counter until the tremor passed. Betrayal is not a single blow. It's a series of small, quiet decisions someone else makes about your worth. The signature I hadn't given didn't matter. He'd found a way around it, or forged what he needed. I thought of Derek then, how he used to say Daniel was born to run ahead of the truth. I had always laughed it off. Now the truth had finally caught up to me, and I was the one left behind. The following day, a courier arrived at my door with a letter in an embossed envelope. Inside was a polite notification from a law firm in Connecticut, stating that, as of recent updates to property documentation, all future correspondence should be directed to the primary owner. It was the written equivalent of exile. I folded it back into the envelope and placed it in a drawer I hadn't used before. Later that afternoon, I walked into town to the small public library that still smelled of glue and paper and asked to use the computer. I didn't tell the young librarian what I was looking for. I searched my own name, the property address, anything that might confirm or deny the theft I felt pulsing beneath the surface. That's when I saw it, a notice of lien filed against the property 2 days after my name had been removed. $500,000 secured against the house, my savings, his wife's inheritance, their shared ambition, all tangled into one financial knot. When I stepped outside, the air was damp, and a gull screamed overhead, ugly and alive. I wanted to scream back. Instead, I went to the cafe on Main Street, ordered black coffee, and sat by the window watching the rain turn to mist. I thought of calling Daniel again, demanding explanations. But what would he say? He'd find the same calm tone, the same gentle reasonableness, and talk me out of my own outrage. It's astonishing how children learn to manage their parents like assets. I finished my coffee and walked home through the drizzle, letting it soak my coat, letting it wash away the impulse to beg for clarity. That night, I opened the old envelope where I kept Derek's letters. At the bottom, I found one I'd forgotten, dated 1983, written when Daniel was just a boy. "Don't let him mistake kindness for weakness," Derek had written. It's a fine line, but it matters. I'd crossed that line so many times I'd worn it out completely. 2 days later, I received a call from a detective. His tone was courteous, distant, with that slight bureaucratic warmth of someone who wants you to stay calm for the paperwork. He said there was an ongoing investigation into a missing inheritance fund belonging to Carla Harlow. He wanted to confirm whether I had recently authorized any large transfers from joint family accounts. I nearly laughed, though it came out as a choke. I told him I hadn't, that I didn't even have access to those accounts anymore. He said that was precisely why he was calling, because someone had used my old credentials to move funds 6 weeks earlier, right before the lien was placed. It's likely a mix-up, he added, almost kindly, but I could hear the weight of implication. I was a name on a suspicious transaction. I was the ghost they could pin it on. After I hung up, I sat at the table again, tracing the grain of the wood with my finger, trying to feel real. My mind kept returning to Daniel's face, not the man's, but the boy's. That summer he broke his arm climbing the fence and cried not from pain, but from fear of being scolded. I remembered holding him close, whispering, "I'm here. You can tell me anything." I wondered when that promise had expired. The silence of the house was deep and almost comforting, the way empty rooms can be when no one expects you to defend yourself. Outside, the tide had come in. The air tasted metallic. I realized, with a clarity that was both cold and relieving, that my son wasn't just careless. He was capable. He had planned this. Maybe Carla had too, or maybe she was his mirror, reflecting back the version of him he wanted to believe in. Either way, I was the collateral damage. That night, I didn't boil water. I poured myself a glass of wine, the cheap red kind that stains your tongue, and drank it slowly while the radio hummed a song I didn't know. Each sip steadied me, not in the numbing way I expected, but in a sharpening one. The shock began to settle into something more deliberate. I could feel the hinge inside me shifting, the slow turn from confusion to decision. I thought of the forged papers, the missing money, the quiet competence with which they had removed me from my own life. And I thought, if they could do it so efficiently, then so could I. I could reclaim what was left. I didn't know yet how, but I knew the next call I made wouldn't be to Daniel. It would be to someone who understood what it means when a woman stops apologizing for existing. I closed the radio, turned off the light, and whispered into the dark, "You wanted me gone. You're about to find out what gone really looks like." I woke the next morning with a heaviness in my chest that was not quite sorrow and not yet anger, something denser, quieter, the kind of emotion that doesn't dissolve but crystallizes. The sunlight fell through the thin curtains in long, watery strips, and for the first time in years, I felt completely sober, not from alcohol, but from illusion. I made myself a proper breakfast, 2 eggs and a slice of bread browned too long in the toaster, and sat at the table without the radio on. I wanted silence, the honest kind, not the polished quiet that had ruled my son's house. I thought of calling the detective again, but something in me wanted to wait, to see what would surface if I did nothing, what shape truth would take when left unprovoked. I spent that afternoon walking along the beach where the tide pulled back far enough to reveal dark patches of stone slick with seaweed. Children played near the pier, mothers calling warnings that were more habit than concern, and the smell of salt clung to everything. I realized that no one here knew me as anyone's mother. To them, I was just another old woman walking with slow, steady steps, and the anonymity was oddly liberating. By the time I returned home, a letter had been slipped under my door. The first line read, "Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding." He went on for 2 pages about confusion with the refinance, how the bank had mishandled signatures, how the lawyer had advised temporary changes that would soon be corrected. He mentioned Carla only once, describing her as upset and tired, as though her exhaustion were my fault. Then came the real message hidden between the lines, a warning not to get involved with unnecessary drama or contact anyone without consulting him first. The arrogance was familiar, practiced. He ended with, "I'll fix it. Just don't make things worse." That phrase, almost word for word, was what he'd said when he dented the car at 16 and made me lie to his father. I folded the letter carefully, smoothed the creases with my palm, and slid it back into the envelope. I did not cry, nor did I rage. Instead, I took out my checkbook, wrote down the address of the small legal aid office I had seen near the bus stop, and made an appointment for the next day. The lawyer was a woman in her 30s named Eunice, her hair pulled tight, her eyes quick and curious. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything, every detail from the down payment to the phone call from the detective. When I was finished, she leaned back, exhaled slowly, and said, "Mrs. Harlow, what your son did isn't just unethical. It's criminal, but we have to move carefully." The word carefully tasted both safe and dangerous. She helped me draft a statement for the investigators and explained how to freeze certain accounts. She asked if I had any proof of my financial contribution. I opened my worn purse and handed her the photocopies of the old wire transfers, Derek's will, and the original email Daniel had sent thanking me for funding the future. She looked at the papers like they were relics of a vanished civilization. "This will help," she said softly, "but be prepared. When people like this feel cornered, they rewrite history." Walking home, I felt the strangest sense of equilibrium, as if my life, which had been sliding sideways for years, had suddenly found its footing. The sea was gray and choppy, the sky low, and the wind pushed against me with deliberate resistance. I pushed back. That evening, I wrote in my journal for the first time in a decade. The words came haltingly at first, then steadier. Today, I began the process of reclaiming what was mine, not the money, the narrative. I slept through the night without dreams. The following week, the detective called again, his tone more formal now. He said my statement had been received and that certain inconsistencies had come to light in Daniel's financial records. "We'll be speaking to him soon," he said, and I could hear the professional detachment in his voice struggling to mask curiosity. I thanked him and hung up. An hour later, my phone buzzed again, but this time it was Carla. I hadn't heard her voice since the day she smiled at me across a kitchen that smelled of rosemary and dismissal. She didn't waste time on greetings. "You talked to the police," she said, each word sharp and controlled. I said yes. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I told her that I finally did, and that was precisely why I'd done it. She muttered something about Daniel being under enormous stress, about perception and gossip, about how fragile reputation could be. I let her finish, then asked quietly, "Is that why you forged my signature?" Her breath caught on the other end of the line. She didn't deny it, only whispered, "You should have stayed quiet." Then the line went dead. I stood there with the phone still pressed to my ear long after the call ended. The house felt smaller suddenly, the air dense with something electric. I poured myself another cup of tea and held it with both hands, watching the steam rise like a signal I didn't know how to read. I realized that the fear I had carried for weeks was evaporating, replaced by something steadier, conviction. They had underestimated me, mistaken endurance for passivity. But endurance, I was learning, was a muscle, and mine had been trained for decades. The next morning, a young postal worker knocked on my door with a package requiring signature. It was a thick envelope from Daniel's attorney, full of legal jargon and subtle intimidation, a reminder of confidentiality clauses from past financial transactions. Eunice told me it was an attempt to frighten me into silence. She smiled and said, "They're worried. That's good." She began preparing the preliminary complaint, a tedious process of dates, amounts, authorizations. I watched her work, her pen moving with controlled urgency, and thought about how power changes shape depending on who holds the pen. Weeks passed like that. Paperwork, calls, nights filled with the steady hum of uncertainty. The town around me shifted seasons. The tourists left, the wind turned colder, and the sea grew darker. I started taking long walks to the cliffs in the mornings, my cane tapping against the uneven path, and sometimes I'd speak aloud just to hear the sound of my own voice carried off by the wind. I told Derek about it all, as if he were still there beside me. "You'd be proud," I said once, stopping to catch my breath. Not of the fight, but of the quiet way I'm standing through it. One afternoon, I found a small note tucked beneath my door again. This one wasn't from Daniel. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful, almost shy. It read, "Mrs. Harlow, I'm the neighbor across the street, Joyce. Saw a man snooping around last night, looking at your windows. Didn't like the look of him. Call me if you need someone to walk you to town." I looked at the number, then at the dark smear of ink where the pen had pressed too hard. That evening I called her, and she came over with a flashlight and 2 mugs of instant coffee. She was around my age, blunt and practical. When I told her what was happening, she just nodded. "Families," she said, shaking her head. "They'll use your own guilt to pick your bones clean." We sat on the porch in silence for a long time, 2 women who had survived too much politeness. When she left, she said, "You ever need to disappear again? I know people." I thought she was joking, but her eyes told me she wasn't. That night, as the wind howled and the walls sighed, I realized the strange comfort of being witnessed, not pitied, not advised, just seen. Joyce didn't need my history to understand it. She recognized the look of someone who'd been discarded, but not destroyed. I slept better that night than I had in months. In the morning, I found a voicemail from Daniel. His voice was cracking now, stripped of its usual confidence. "Mom, please call me. It's getting bad. They're asking questions about the inheritance. Carla's furious. I don't know what to do." I played the message twice, listening not to his words, but to the tremor underneath them, the sound of a man learning, maybe for the first time, what consequence feels like. I didn't call him back. Instead, I took my coat and walked to the edge of the pier, where the sea was rough and alive, and I whispered into the wind, "You told me not to make things worse." I didn't. I made them true. When I returned home, I locked the door, boiled water for tea, and sat by the window, watching the horizon fade into the kind of dusk that hides everything except the steady glow of resolve. The first wave of fear was gone now, replaced by the calm precision of a woman who has finally stopped apologizing for her own survival. The paperwork, the lawyers, the questions, none of it frightened me anymore. The only thing that did was the possibility that, after everything, I might still miss the boy he used to be. I let that fear sit beside me for a while. Then I opened the window, let the cold air in, and said to the sea, "Take it. I've carried enough." The change began quietly, not as a burst of courage or a single decisive moment, but as a slow rearranging of my insides, the way a house settles after years of strain. I had spent months reacting, defending, explaining, waiting for permission to breathe, and one morning I woke up and realized I didn't need permission anymore. It was early spring. The sky had that pale, bruised color that never quite decides between gray and blue. I put on my coat and walked to the legal aid office before it opened. Eunice arrived with her coffee and keys and found me waiting by the door. She didn't seem surprised. Inside, the office smelled of paper, stale air, and something faintly floral from the cleaner they used. I sat across from her desk and said, "I'm ready to make a formal statement." I think she had been waiting for those words because she didn't ask if I was sure. She simply turned on the recorder, clicked her pen, and nodded for me to begin. I spoke for 2 hours, longer than I expected, telling everything from the first check I wrote for Daniel's house to the forged documents, the missing money, the calls from Carla, the threat-laced letter from their lawyer. I didn't stutter. My voice didn't tremble. When I finished, Eunice turned off the recorder and looked at me for a long moment before saying, "That was brave." I smiled slightly, though it didn't feel like bravery. It felt like breathing after years of shallow air. After that morning, something in me straightened. I began to walk differently, not faster, just steadier. I even caught myself humming once while washing dishes. The sea outside my window no longer looked endless, but directional, as if it had somewhere to go and was inviting me to follow. I started keeping track of small victories. The day the bank confirmed that my name had been added back to a joint investigation file. The day the detective called to say my information had led to progress. The day I realized I had gone an entire week without checking the phone for Daniel's voice. Still, there were nights when the silence pressed against me, heavy and alive. I found myself talking out loud, not to him, but to the woman I used to be, the one who would have apologized for causing trouble. "You did nothing wrong," I would tell her, and sometimes I believed it. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, a simple stew, the kind Derek used to love, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, a woman stood there, maybe in her 40s, with a badge clipped to her coat. She introduced herself as Detective Alvarado from the Financial Crimes Division. She asked if she could come in, and I led her to the kitchen where the smell of onions and broth filled the air. She didn't sit right away, just stood by the counter studying me with the cautious respect people reserve for those who've survived something. She explained that the investigation had expanded, that they had found multiple accounts in Daniel's name connected to funds traced from Carla's inheritance. "We believe she didn't act alone," she said. I told her I could have saved them the trouble. They had always been a partnership, in love and in deceit. Still, hearing it said aloud by someone in authority made it more real. Before she left, she placed a card on the table and said, "If he contacts you, don't engage. Just call me." I nodded, but inside I knew I would answer if he did. Curiosity is the last thread between a mother and her child. Later that week, I received a letter from the bank confirming that my earlier account, the one Daniel had drained, had been frozen pending investigation. It should have brought relief, but instead I felt an unexpected ache. That account had been my safety net for decades, the last tangible link to the life Derek and I had built, a life of work and ordinary dreams. Now it was another exhibit in a case file. I went for a long walk after reading it, following the curve of the shoreline until the wind pushed tears from my eyes. I told myself it was the salt, not sorrow, but I knew better. I was grieving not the money, but the story I had told myself about my family. The illusion had been comfortable, even in its pain. Without it, I was unanchored, but perhaps that was the point. You cannot start again if you keep circling the same wound. That night, I wrote Daniel a letter I never intended to send. I told him about the mornings he used to sit on the kitchen counter kicking his heels while I packed his school lunch, how he once swore he'd buy me a house by the ocean when he grew up. I told him he had done it, in a way, because I was here now, by the sea, and it was mine, bought not with his money, but with my own survival. I told him I forgave him for being small, for confusing ambition with worth. Then I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside Derek's old watch. It wasn't forgiveness, not really. It was acknowledgement, and that was enough. The next day, Joyce came over carrying a pot of soup and her usual brusque humor. She'd become my companion of sorts, appearing without warning and leaving without ceremony. She told me she'd heard gossip in town, that an elegant woman with too much perfume had been asking if I still lived here. Carla, of course. I should have been alarmed, but instead I laughed, a dry sound that surprised even me. "Let her look," I said. "There's nothing left here for her to take." Joyce raised an eyebrow, impressed. We ate the soup together at my wobbly table, and she told me about her daughter in Montana who never called. We didn't exchange sympathy. We simply existed side by side in the unspoken understanding that loss is less lonely when shared without pity. A few days later, the detective called again to inform me that they were preparing formal charges. She said Daniel was cooperating, which likely meant he was trying to save himself. I thanked her, hung up, and sat for a long time staring at the phone. I thought about what cooperation meant in this context. Did it mean he'd finally confessed, or just redirected blame onto Carla? I would never know for sure. What mattered was that for the first time, I was not the one covering for him. I was not the mother who soothed or excused. I was the witness. There was a strange dignity in that role, colder than love, but sturdier. One evening, not long after, I went into town to buy groceries. The clerk, a young man with a shy smile, helped me pack my bags and said, "You've got a strong walk, ma'am. My grandma can barely get to the mailbox." I laughed and told him strength was just stubbornness in better shoes. On the way home, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the far-off hum of the sea. I realized I was humming again, that low tune I didn't recognize but had started to trust. When I reached the cottage, I turned on every light, made myself tea, and sat by the window watching the first drops hit the glass. For years, I had lived inside other people's definitions of goodness and sacrifice, but now I understood that survival has its own grace. It doesn't have to be loud or pure. It just has to continue. That night, as the storm rolled in, I dreamt of Derek for the first time in years. He stood by the shore, the waves breaking around his feet, and he was smiling the way he used to when something amused him, and he didn't want to admit it. "You took your time," he said in the dream, not accusingly but almost fondly. I wanted to tell him everything, to show him the letters, the papers, the quiet apartment. But he just looked at me and said, "You always did know how to swim." When I woke, the storm had passed and the world smelled new. The kettle was whistling again, softer this time, almost companionable. I made tea, sat at the table, and opened the curtains wide. Outside, the light was fragile but persistent, the kind of light that finds its way through any crack. For the first time, I realized I wasn't waiting for justice or apology. I was waiting for my own reflection to look back without flinching. And as I sipped my tea and watched the sea roll in and out with patient rhythm, I knew that moment had finally arrived. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that carried no warning in its light. I had just finished hanging the laundry on the small line behind the cottage when I noticed the envelope wedged beneath the front door. There was no return address, only my name written in Daniel's hand, that precise, deliberate handwriting that had always seemed to apologize for existing on the same page as mine. For a long while, I didn't move. I stood in the doorway with the envelope in my hand, the ocean wind pressing against my back, like a living thing urging me either to open it or to throw it away. I carried it to the table, made myself a cup of tea, and stared at it while the steam curled upward in patient spirals. Finally, I opened it with the butter knife, as if carefulness could dull whatever pain was inside. The letter began without greeting. "I'm coming to see you," it said. "We need to talk before this gets any worse." The words were both threat and plea, and I couldn't decide which frightened me more. He arrived that same evening, earlier than I expected, just as the sky was dimming into that watery twilight that makes everything appear like a memory of itself. I heard his car before I saw it, the sound of tires on gravel, too loud for the quiet street. When I opened the door, he stood there in a gray coat that didn't fit him right, thinner than I remembered, with that restless energy of someone who has spent too long lying to himself. He looked at me as though trying to calculate what version of me he could still manipulate. "Can I come in?" he asked, though he was already stepping across the threshold. I let him. I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted to see for myself what kind of man my son had become. The cottage suddenly felt smaller, the air thick with his cologne, the same scent Derek used to wear, only cheaper now. Synthetic, imitating something it could never be again. He sat at the table, glancing around like a stranger appraising a stranger's home. "You've done well for yourself," he said with forced lightness, and I almost laughed. I poured him tea out of habit, and when he took the cup, his hands trembled slightly. For a moment, he looked like a boy again, and I hated that I noticed. Then his eyes hardened, and the performance began. "Mom, I need your help," he said, leaning forward. "They're making a mess of things. The police don't understand what really happened. It's not as bad as they think, but if you keep talking to them, they'll twist everything." I didn't answer. He mistook my silence for weakness, the way he always had, and pressed on. "You know I'd never do anything to hurt you. You know me better than anyone." He said it softly, almost tenderly, and I felt that familiar pull of maternal reflex, that dangerous instinct to protect even at my own expense. But underneath his words, I heard something new: panic. He pulled a folder from his coat and slid it across the table. Inside were documents, photocopies of financial statements, account transfers, legal letters. "This shows it wasn't me," he said. "Carla did this. She moved the inheritance without telling me. I just signed what she asked. If you back me up, if you tell them you knew about the transfers, it'll clear my name." I stared at the folder but didn't touch it. He mistook my restraint for hesitation and kept talking faster. "Mom, please. You don't understand. They're threatening to freeze everything. I could lose my job, my reputation. You've already been through enough. I don't want them dragging you into this." His voice cracked on the last sentence, and for a moment I saw the fear beneath the arrogance, but I also saw calculation. The performance was for survival, not redemption. I said his name quietly, and he stopped speaking. "Daniel," I said again, tasting the syllables as if they were foreign. "Do you remember what your father used to say about truth?" He looked at me blankly, then shrugged, impatient. He said truth is like the tide. It waits, it pulls back, but it always returns. Daniel gave a short laugh, bitter and nervous. "Mom, this isn't a poetry lesson. I'm trying to keep us both out of jail." The word us struck me like a slap. There was no us. There hadn't been for a long time. I reached over and closed the folder gently, slid it back toward him. "I'm not signing anything," I said. The calmness of my voice startled even me. His face changed then, not suddenly but gradually, as though the mask he had been holding in place was melting. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You don't get it," he said softly. "If you don't help me, they'll think you were involved too. You were on those accounts. They'll come after you." I met his gaze and said, Let them. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The kettle began to whistle softly, and the sound filled the space between us like a third presence. He stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen, running a hand through his hair. "Carla's gone," he said finally. "She took what was left and disappeared. I don't even know where she is." I felt a strange pity then, the kind that isn't love, but memory. He was unraveling, but he still didn't understand that it was his own doing. He stopped pacing and turned to me, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "Mom, I made mistakes, but I can fix this. You just have to trust me." I looked at him, this man who shared my blood, but none of my integrity, and I realized that trust had become a language we no longer spoke. He stayed for another hour, circling the same arguments, growing more desperate as I remained silent. At one point, he slammed his hand on the table, shouting that I was ruining his life. I didn't flinch. "You already ruined it," I said quietly. "You just finally noticed." He stared at me, stunned, and I saw something collapse behind his eyes. Not guilt, not even remorse, but recognition. He gathered his papers, his movements jerky, and on his way out he stopped at the door. "You'll regret this," he said. His voice wasn't angry, it was tired. "Maybe," I answered, "but at least it will be mine to regret." When he drove away, I stood at the window, watching the headlights fade until they disappeared into the darkness. The sea roared in the distance, as if approving. The next morning, Detective Alvarado called to inform me that Daniel had turned himself in for questioning. "He claims he was coerced by his wife," she said. "He's naming her as the primary perpetrator." Her tone was neutral, but I could hear the fatigue beneath it. I asked if that would help him. She sighed. "It's complicated, but your statement helped clarify things. You did the right thing." After we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the phone, not sure what right even meant anymore. The truth was out, yes, but truth doesn't mend anything. It just stops the rot from spreading further. That week was a blur of calls and paperwork. Eunice updated me on the case. The lawyers exchanged letters, and for the first time I was treated not as a suspect or witness, but as a participant with agency. I should have felt triumphant, but mostly I felt hollow. The house seemed quieter, though nothing had changed. Even the kettle's whistle sounded weary. I began to write again in my journal, longer entries this time, pages filled not with sorrow, but with observation. I wrote about the rhythm of the sea, about the way the gulls fought over scraps with a kind of furious dignity, about how survival sometimes looks like pettiness from a distance. Then, one evening, I heard footsteps outside. When I opened the door, Carla stood there. She looked different, thinner, her makeup gone, her eyes wide and glassy. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and for a moment she looked like a child lost at a fair. "May I come in?" she asked. I hesitated, but stepped aside. She sat in the same chair Daniel had occupied days earlier, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. "He told them everything," she said without preamble. "Every lie, every account. I'm done." Her voice was flat, exhausted. I poured tea without asking if she wanted any. She took the cup and stared into it as though hoping for answers at the bottom. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said. "It was supposed to be easy. Just transfers, paperwork. He said you'd never notice. He said you wanted him to have it." She laughed bitterly. "I thought he was taking care of you." I didn't interrupt. There was nothing she could say that would surprise me now. She kept talking, words spilling out like confession and performance combined. When the money started to vanish, he blamed me. said I was careless. I thought he was protecting us, but he was just protecting himself. When the police started asking questions, he told me to disappear. So I did. She looked up then, her eyes red and unguarded. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Not because I got caught, but because I see you now. You were never the enemy. You were the mirror." For the first time, I believed her. It didn't change anything, but belief isn't always about forgiveness. Sometimes it's just recognition. She left after an hour, leaving behind her untouched tea and the faint scent of desperation. I stood at the window again, watching her walk away down the narrow path toward the main road. The tide was coming in, erasing footprints in the sand as quickly as they were made. I thought of Daniel then, of the boy he had been, of the man he had become, and I realized that perhaps this was his inheritance, not money or property, but the inevitability of consequence. I didn't pity him anymore. I didn't hate him either. He had chosen his own drowning. In the days that followed, I felt something shift again, deeper this time. It wasn't relief or triumph, but a strange peace, the kind that comes when the worst has already happened and you are still standing. I began tending the small garden behind the cottage, planting herbs and a few flowers. My hands remembered the motions as if they had been waiting for permission. The soil was cold and alive beneath my fingers. Each seed I placed felt like a small defiance against everything that had tried to bury me. A week later, Eunice called to tell me that the case was moving forward to court, that my testimony might be required. "You'll need to face him," she said gently. I told her I wasn't afraid, and I wasn't. The thought of seeing him no longer filled me with dread, but with a kind of solemn curiosity. I wanted to see if he would recognize me, not as his mother, not as the woman he could manipulate, but as the one person he could no longer deceive. That night, I opened the window and let the wind fill the room. The sea was rough again, waves slamming against the rocks like a heartbeat too strong to be ignored. I whispered into the darkness, "It's almost over." But I knew it wasn't really about ending. It was about returning to myself, to the truth, to the quiet certainty that I had survived what was meant to erase me. I closed the window, turned off the lights, and let the darkness settle around me like an old, familiar coat. Outside, the tide was still coming in, relentless and sure, the same rhythm that had always been there, waiting for me to remember that I belonged to it. They called my name the way you call a witness from a roster, without history, without the small intimacies that make a life, just syllables in a room that smelled of old varnish and colder ambitions. And when I stood, I felt the strange lightness. That comes when there is nothing left to hide behind. No choreography of apology or softening adjectives to make other people more comfortable. Only the simple fact of having lived through what I am about to say. I walked to the stand past rows of faces arranged by allegiance and fatigue, past the nervous twitch of paper in a young lawyer's hands, past Carla sitting very still in a dress too thin for the air, past Daniel who would not look at me. And when the clerk swore me in, I spoke in a voice that did not shake, not because I was fearless, but because fear had finally found its proper size. The prosecutor's questions were not complicated: dates and amounts and signatures, the origin of the down payment, the emails where my son thanked me for funding the future, the refinance packet that arrived in my inbox dressed as housekeeping, and, carrying a scalpel, the bank clerk's polite cruelty when she told me my name had already been lifted from the title like a smudge from glass, the detective's first call about a missing inheritance that had the gall to borrow my old credentials, the letter from a lawyer that tried to muzzle me with tone, if not law, Each answer another stone placed where something had washed away. When the defense asked if I might have misremembered authorizations or misunderstood transfers, I told them I have been keeping a household ledger since 1972 and can still recite the price of apples the week Derek lost his job, that misremembering has never been my luxury. And when they asked if I was motivated by anger, I said I was motivated by oxygen because some truths suffocate in closed rooms and need to be spoken in the open where everyone can watch them breathe. There was a moment, small, almost private, in which I felt the room lean forward as I described the afternoon Daniel sat at my kitchen table asking me to lie, the way his hands shook a little while his voice rehearsed steadiness, the way he said us, as if pronouns could erase signatures, and I did not decorate the story or punish him with adjectives. I simply placed the scene on the table and left it there until the silence did the rest. When it was over, they thanked me, because institutions run on manners, and I stepped down and returned to the bench with my hands unclenched, noticing in a detached way that the trembling I had expected never arrived, that I had not once looked for Daniel's eyes to measure whether my pain registered as believable in the theater of his conscience, that I had left the part of me that still asked for his understanding somewhere between the oath and the second exhibit, and in that absence there was room to breathe. The judge spoke in the dry cadence of systems turning, rulings about freezes and liens, and the chain of custody for money that had been taught to move like smoke. And while the lawyers argued finer points, I signed the first of the papers Eunice slid toward me, the ones that restored my standing, the ones that allowed me to trigger the sale clause buried like a lifeboat in the original deed, and the pen felt heavier than it should have, as if it remembered all the times I had used it to sign checks no one thanked me for. Outside the courthouse, the wind came hard off the river and lifted my hair like a hand from an older life blessing the new one, and Detective Alvarado walked with me to the steps and said, not unkindly, that for a long time this would feel like justice only in theory, so I should find a way to make it real for myself. I knew what she meant, because paper can fix what was taken and still fail to return what was erased. So I told her my plan, and she nodded the way people do when they hear the soundness of an answer before they understand the details. 2 weeks later, with the court orders in place and the listing agent pretending not to remember how houses smell when a family tries to live in them and fails, I stood in the empty foyer of a property my money had bought and my absence had curated, ran my fingers along the edge of the marble island where I had never sliced an onion, touched the smooth frame of a gallery wall where my face had never fit, opened the private office, and found the small wooden box exactly where I had seen it years ago, the note inside still folded beneath the photograph of a boy with a missing tooth, and I did not take it because I was not there to steal back evidence of tenderness. I was there to do the one thing that would not be undone. I signed the closing documents, watched the title pass through my hands like a river redirected, and when the wire hit my account, I did not think of revenge or victory. I thought of oxygen again, of air in a room that had been sealed. On the way home, I stopped at the bank with the carpet that always smells faintly like pennies and winter coats, and the teller with the purple nails counted the figures twice, and then looked up at me as if to confirm I was the person who knew what to do next. I did, and it didn't involve hoarding or hiding. Not because I'm above either, but because grace is sometimes the most practical tool we have. So I opened a new account with a name that made the manager smile without asking questions. Quiet, Harbor, and I authorized monthly disbursements to the legal aid office that had lent me a spine when mine was busy holding the rest of me up, and a scholarship at the community college for women who are starting late because someone taught them their time belonged to everyone else. And I set aside enough to ensure no one ever again could use the word liability to describe my existence. And when the papers were stamped and the numbers stopped blinking on the screen, I felt something settle in me, like a house-finding level. I walked back to the cottage where the laundry, forgotten, had stiffened in the salt air, and I rehung the damp shirts on the line with the concentration of someone who knows that order. To mean anything must be chosen and not imposed. Daniel called that evening from an unfamiliar number. I answered without surprise, and he said my name like it was both apology and accusation, and he asked if the sale had to be final, if we could find another arrangement, if I understood what I had done. And I told him in a voice as gentle as I could make it that final is the point, because there are doors you only learn to walk through when you burn the hallway behind you. And he was quiet a long time, and then he said he hoped one day I would forgive him, and I said there might be a day when I no longer needed that word to make sense of my past, but it would not be a gift I handed him. We ended the call without the choreography of love, not cruel, just true, and when the phone went still, I set it face down under a folded napkin, the way you teach a restless animal to sleep. That night, Joyce came by with a slice of something she called pie, and I called an apology from the gods for how long we've all had to wait to eat in peace, and we sat on the porch while the sea practiced its eternal argument with the shore, and I told her how the courtroom felt like a church without the part where you're promised heaven if you behave. And she said that was still a better bargain than most of what we'd been offered. And then she saw the spare key to Daniel's old condo on my ring, a relic I'd carried out of habit, and she said softly that it looked heavy, and without ceremony, I slid it free, walked to the edge of the bluff, and let it fall into the dark water where so many vows have been refined by pressure into the minerals of truth. The splash was small and absolute, and I did not make a wish, because wishes are for people who still believe someone else is listening. In the weeks that followed, there were headlines with careful words. There were statements from lawyers that sounded like damp paper tearing. There were neighbors in a state I no longer lived in who said they had always suspected something. There were emails I didn't answer, and one letter from Carla written in the kind of handwriting people practice when they want to look honest. And I read it once and placed it in the drawer with Derek's watch and the unsent letter to my son, not because I plan to keep a shrine to pain, but because memory, to be trustworthy, must hold all the rooms at once. On the morning the proceeds posted in full, I boiled water and let the kettle wail as long as it wanted. Then I lifted it before it burned, poured tea into the cracked blue mug that has survived every move I've made away from someone else's terms. And I wrote a final note to the lawyer who had sent threats as if tone could be law. 2 sentences only, that I was of sound mind and not to be contacted again, that any further communication should be directed to my counsel. And I sealed it and walked it to the post office where the clerk stamped it with a thud that sounded very much like a door being closed on purpose. When I stepped back into the light, the wind smelled of kelp and brass, and the tide had turned while no one was watching, which is how tides do their best work. And I realized I no longer needed to rehearse the story to believe it, that the climax people talk about is not a cymbal crash, but a hinge, a turning so complete the old view is no longer visible unless you decide to Look over your shoulder, and I am done with that angle. That evening, because celebration at my age is a quiet verb, I made Derek's stew and folded a note for myself into the recipe card, a single line that would make sense later when doubt, like weather, tries again. You didn't win, you stopped losing, and I tucked it back among the cards stained with years of sauce and care, and I ate at the small table with the window open to let the sound of the sea sit with me, and I understood that no one would come to reclaim this moment or rename it, that it belonged to me in the way air belongs to lungs, not by law but by use. When night settled, heavy and kind, I stood at the doorway and told the darkness what I had done, not in a voice begging for witness, but as inventory. And then I went to bed and slept without the court's permission, without the old reflex to wake at every sound that wasn't mine. And in the morning, the room was full of ordinary light, and the kettle began to sing again, not as alarm or lament, but as a friend who knows you, well enough to be loud and still not be mistaken for a threat. The mornings are slower now, the kind that stretch like fabric pulled gently across a table, the kind that forget to rush toward purpose. I wake to the sound of the sea rearranging itself against the rocks, to the hiss of wind that knows the language of endings. The kettle begins its familiar complaint, that thin cry that once sounded like loneliness and now sounds like life doing what it must. I have stopped counting the days since the trial, since the signatures and the letters and the headlines, and time has softened into something without edges. The money sits where it sits, still and obedient, but it does not sing. It is a tool, not a redemption. Sometimes I look at the account balance on the small screen and close it quickly, afraid that the numbers might start whispering promises they cannot keep. What keeps me company now is smaller and steadier, the creak of the wooden floor when I walk barefoot to open the curtains, the salt that settles on every surface no matter how often I wipe it away, the voice of a neighbor calling her dog at dusk. It turns out peace has a texture, rough but generous, like linen dried too long in the wind. I have not heard from Daniel in many months. I know, through Eunice, that he completed a plea deal, that Carla gave her own statement, that there are fines and community service and a probationary future stretching in front of him like a road that looks longer when you have to walk it alone. She asked if I wanted to know the details, and I told her no. Details are for historians. I am not writing history. I am living what remains of a life that finally belongs to me. Still, sometimes in the gray hour before dawn, I think of him, not as a man in trouble, but as the boy who once fell asleep with his hand wrapped around my thumb, the way children claim their safety through touch. I do not forgive him. That word feels too much like a transaction, a bookkeeping of wounds. What I feel is quieter and stranger. I have stopped negotiating with the past. It exists, unchanged, but it no longer drafts the terms of my breathing. There are days when the sea is so calm it looks like glass. And I walk along the pier with Joyce, who has become the kind of friend that does not require conversation. We share thermoses of coffee and let the silence speak for us. She tells me about her daughter, still distant, and I tell her about the herbs sprouting in my garden, the parsley that refuses to die even when the nights turn sharp. Once she said, "You seem lighter," and I laughed because it's true. I am lighter in the way an empty jar is lighter than one filled with things it no longer needs to store. I have written to the legal aid office asking that the scholarship be named after no one, because women do not need another name to work under. They need a space that is not borrowed. The director sent a thank you letter printed on cream paper, saying they would hang a plaque in the lobby. I folded it carefully and used it to line a drawer that holds my scarves. The gesture was enough. In the afternoons, I read again. Books I once abandoned because there was never enough time. Novels whose pages smell like old tea. I find myself stopping mid-sentence just to listen to the world outside, to the rhythm of the waves and the occasional laughter from the cafe down the street. I have learned that happiness is not a state, but a series of permissions to rest, to listen, to stop pretending you are not tired. Sometimes I think of writing everything down, turning it into a story someone might recognize themselves in. But then I realize I already have. Each day lived differently is its own sentence written across time. Once, at the market, a young woman asked me how long I'd lived in town. Long enough to forget what leaving feels like, I told her. She smiled, not understanding, and that was fine. Not every truth needs an audience. One evening in early autumn, I walked to the edge of the pier just as the sun was beginning to sink, the sky the color of bruised peaches, soft and forgiving. I had a small envelope in my pocket, Daniel's last letter still unopened. I had kept it for months, unsure whether courage meant reading or discarding. The wind was cool, and the boards beneath my feet were damp. I opened the envelope carefully, as if it might bruise. Inside, only a few lines. I didn't think you'd ever turn on me. I hope someday you'll remember how much I tried to make you proud. The words were almost tender in their blindness. I folded the letter once, then again, and slipped it into the water, watching as it darkened and curled, carried off by the tide that had always known how to take what no longer belonged on land. I whispered after it, not a curse and not a prayer, just a simple truth. I didn't turn on you, Daniel. I turned toward myself. The wind caught the words and scattered them, and I let them go. When I came home, the house smelled of rain and bread. Joyce had left a note on the door. Stopped by, fed the cat, borrowed sugar. Life in its small continuities. I lit the lamp, poured a cup of tea, and sat by the window watching the dark arrive without ceremony. The world was not fairer, not kinder, but it was honest, and that was enough. I took out my journal and wrote a single line before closing it again. Peace is not the absence of noise, but the refusal to explain your quiet. I let the pen rest there and looked out at the sea, its surface shifting under the moon like a patient creature that had seen everything and forgiven nothing but still kept moving. I thought of all the women I have been, the wife who believed in effort, the mother who mistook endurance for love, the guest in her own house, the exile, the witness, the survivor, and I felt a slow, deep gratitude that I had lived long enough to meet this version of myself, the one who knows that dignity is not something you demand. It's something you stop surrendering. Now, when morning comes, I open the window before the kettle begins to cry. The air rushes in cold and clean, and I stand there for a long while, letting it touch my face. The sea is always there, constant and restless, a mirror that never flatters but never lies. I no longer ask it for answers. I only listen to its rhythm, the endless coming and going, and understand that this, too, is a kind of prayer. Somewhere behind that horizon, my son is living whatever version of repentance or denial he can manage. And somewhere beyond that, Derek's voice is just another note in the wind. And here, in this small house, I am both memory and beginning. They called it betrayal once, what I did when I spoke, when I refused to look away, when I saved myself. But betrayal, I have learned, is another word for being seen by someone who preferred your silence. Tonight I will sleep with the window open, the sea breathing for me, and in the morning I will wake not to the sound of loss, but to the sound of a life that, after everything, is still mine.